Hey everyone, and welcome to another web design tutorial. Today I'll be talking about responsive web design, and in particular how to handle typography in responsive sites. First, I'll quickly review absolute and relative font size values, namely pixels, ems, and rems, so we all have a clear understanding about the differences between them. Next, I'll show a quick example of how font sizing can cause problems in responsive sites. And then finally, I'll provide a quick and easy method for setting up responsive font sizing using media queries and the Rem unit of measurement. All the files I'll be using in this tutorial can be found in the link below the video, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so what we'll do now is we'll kind of walk through three examples. First, I want to look at sort of the traditional way of resizing fonts, and that's using pixels. And so pixels are sort of the closest thing related to points. So if you're familiar with Microsoft Word or sort of any other word processing software, you'll have a framework for points, right? So 12-point font is usually the default sort of normal font size for print documentation, so things that you might create in Microsoft Word. Pixels are very similar to points in that they represent specific and absolute sizes of your fonts. And so I think that typically gives people the easiest framework to work within is to think about font sizing using pixels. And also, just as a quick aside, 1 pixel is 0.75 points. So for example, 12-point font on a print document would be 16 pixels if we do the math, the conversion. All that being said, let's take a look at an HTML document. So you'll see this here on the left side of the screen here. And the HTML document is very simple, and it's just got some common HTML elements. So we've got header 1, header 2, we've got some paragraph text, and then we've got a few list items. And so this is what you'll see if you rendered the HTML in a web browser. This is the default browser settings, right? So this has no styles attached to them, and this is what it looks like in the browser. Now, if you wanted to change the header, for example, so if we wanted to make this header much bigger, for example, we wanted to make it more prominent, we could in CSS, change the font size by using pixels, right? So we could make it huge and make it maybe 65 pixels. So if we made it 65 pixels, we can refresh and we can see really how big that header actually is, right? And so that's sort of the easiest framework for many people to work within is to use, to alter font size of their websites using pixels. Okay, so that's the first sort of way to size and resize font on a website is using pixels. The second thing that you can do is to use a more relative, so pixels are an absolute measurement, right? 65 pixels refers to an absolute measurement. We can use relative measurements or relative values to resize things as well. And the first sort of set of relative values that I want to walk through are ems, EMs. And ems are relative to when you set the em value for a particular item in HTML or in CSS, it's relative to the size of the parent item. Okay, so an em is essentially a multiplier. So let me just give you an example of, and let me erase this CSS real quickly and refresh so that we're back to our default settings here. The em will then be relative to its parent element. Okay, so if we set H1 and we make the font size 4 ems, it's a multiplier, and so our font will now be 4 times the default font size. And in this case is probably 16 pixels because most browsers set the default to 16 pixels. So it should be 64 pixels, and so if I refresh, it should be 64 pixels. Okay, so that's what 4ems look like. So we're multiplying 4 times the parent element, and since we don't have any settings for the parent element, it's just taking the default, and so it's 4 times 16, which is 64 pixels. So if I made this 64 pixels and I saved it and I refresh here, it's going to look, nothing happens, right? It looks exactly the same, right? And so I can make that illustration again, 5ems. So if I change the font size to 5ems and refresh, I'm not real good at math on my toes, so we'll go 5 times 16. This is an 80 pixel thing, so if I change this to 80 pixels and refresh again, nothing changes, right? So that's just kind of showing you the way that ems multiply. Okay, so the m is a unit of measurement that multiplies by its parent element. So for example, if we took, since h1 is inside of a div called container that wraps all of the content, if I made container, if I made the font size for container 2ems, not font sizer, and I made the font size for h1 2ems, now we're multiplying, right? So this is 2ems multiplied by its parent element 2ems, so it's 4ems. So if I refresh, I spelled container wrong. So now it's 4ems, right? And so what we're doing is we're multiplying here, okay? So now we have 4ems. So if I change this to 3, so if I change this container to 3, now our h1, even though it still says 2ems here in the CSS, is going to actually be 6ems, right? So now it's really big. And our default sizing for all the rest of our elements are 3ems. Okay, you can really see this start to get confusing when we look at things like embedded lists or embedded items. So what we have here is a list item, and we've got 2 embedded list items inside of our list item. And so, for example, if I set my UL to 2ems, which is going to multiply the 3em container, so we're really going to look at, we're viewing 6ems here, and I set my li to 2ems, what's going to happen is it's going to multiply multiple times. Okay, so it's going to multiply 2 by 2 by 3. So now we're talking about our list items will be 12ems, and our embedded list items will be 24ems. So if we refresh, we can see, look how big the embedded list items are. And if I change this down to 2, it's a little smaller, but our embedded list items now are gigantic, and our normal list items are pretty big, but not quite as big. And what can get confusing about this, I do this illustration not to confuse you, even though it may have confused you. I do this illustration to really point out how confusing ems can be. They're really helpful in some ways, but they can be confusing unless you have a really strong grasp of how they work. Because if you look at this CSS now, what we're seeing is everything is set to 2ems. So if you're in a sort of an absolute mindset, right, like so if we're thinking about font sizing in pixels, if you make everything 12 pixels, everything is going to be the same. But if you make everything 2ems, everything is not the same because the m is a multiplier. And so I kind of do that illustration, or belabor that illustration to kind of really point out the confusion that can come from using ems unless you've got a really strong grasp on how to use them. So that's the first relative font sizing I want to talk about. The second relative font sizing I want to talk about is unique to CSS3, and it's the rem unit. And the R in the rem unit stands for root M. And rems are actually similar to M's in that they're relative, they're multiplier values, but they're relative to only the root element. And that's going to be really helpful in responsive design, because as we start to build out media queries and as we start to resize things as our browser is resized, it's going to be way easier to manage if you only have to make the change, to make a CSS change to one root element, as opposed to all of your elements. For example, if you're using pixels, right? So if you're using pixels and you say H1 is 36 pixels, UL is 16 pixels, paragraphs are 12 pixels, you're gonna have to resize every one of those elements. If you've got your typography all in pixels, but if you've got your typography in using the rem unit, all you have to change is the root. Okay. So all that being said, let's take a look at the rem unit. I'm gonna save this, clear out the CSS and save it and refresh, and this is again back to the default. So the rem unit is the R in the rem unit again stands for root M, and the root of any HTML page is the HTML tag. So what we can do then is we can set our font size of the HTML. So maybe we want to set our font size to 20 pixels. So that'll be our default font size for everything. Okay. So if I refresh, our default font size for everything now is 20 pixels. Header 1s and header 2s are now just taking the default browser settings and multiplying it by the 20 pixels. Okay. But all the rest of our text is 20 pixels. So what's cool about the rem unit is we can now set, depending on what size we want, we can now set the rem unit and we know exactly what we're multiplying against, right? So it doesn't cascade down the way that the M unit does. So if we refresh now and we want the font size for H1 to be 4 rems, really big, we know that this is going to be 80 pixels, and we know that because we're multiplying 4 by 20 pixels. And if we want our H2 to be maybe, oh, that's a G, our H2 to be 3 rems, we know that this is going to be, if we refresh, 60 pixels. And then maybe we want all of our paragraph and list items, so kind of more of the body text, to be 1M, just whatever our default font size is. We can do that, and if we refresh, nothing's going to change because it's just pulling the default font size. Okay. So the problem with font sizing in responsive design, or the primary problem that most people run into, is a problem of proportion, right? So what looks good on one viewport or on one device may not look good or proportional on another device. And so if we just take this example, if we resize our viewport into what might be a mobile viewport, or the viewport, the view that you might see on a mobile device, you'll see that the header 1 remains the same, right? So, and the issue here then is, okay, we need to resize this header. We need to make it a little bit smaller for a mobile device. How are we going to do that? Well, the primary way to do that is to use media queries. And so what I want to do now is to walk through how can we use media queries and use the rem unit to make this process a little bit easier. Okay, so now the last thing I want to do is I want to take a look at how to set up a grid or a set of media queries that will allow for responsive, that'll allow for your typography to respond to the size of the viewport and give a proportional view that makes sense for the user. And so to do this, what I've done is I've set up a series of media queries from largest at the bottom to smallest at the top. And then what I want to do is I just want to quickly walk through what I sort of copied and pasted in here. The first thing I want to do is really quickly just reiterate what the media query is saying, so that everybody's clear as to what the media query is doing. So a media query allows you to essentially tell the browser specific styles for particular sizes of the viewport. So for example, this says at media screen and then here's the rule: min width 1000 pixels. So basically what this is saying is, for any viewport that's a minimum width of 1000 pixels, so what we're saying here is 1000 pixels or larger, so this takes care of the range of 1000 pixels or anything bigger than 1000 pixels, we're going to set our root element to a font size of 22 pixels. So that's what our original, or I guess our original was 20. Our original font size was 20. I just set this grid or this system up with a font size of 22 pixels. Now, I will say this on the front end: you can make these root font sizes any size you want, whatever you're comfortable with within your design. This is just an example of how this would look if we started sort of at the biggest, at 22 on the largest end, and then progressively getting smaller. And so again, I'll also say this on the front end: the principle is, as we resize the viewport, we want to resize our text elements in a way that makes sense. And so one thing we're going to want to do is we're going to progressively want to make these really large header items smaller as we get into a smaller viewport. Okay, so what I've done here is I've set up a grid, and you can download this grid or this set of media queries. You can download this in the files linked below the video. But what we're doing here is we are setting up a series of media queries. So this is for 1000 and larger. We'll make the root font size 22 pixels. For 920 and larger, so between 920 and 1000 pixels, we're going to set the font size to 21. Between 860 and 920, we're going to make it a little smaller. Between 800 and 860, we're going to make it a little smaller, and so on and so forth, all the way down to between 500 and 570, we're going to make it 14 pixels. And so the only thing that we have to do now is we need to probably change this root element to 13 pixels. So that takes care of anything smaller than 500 pixels. Okay, so again, what we've done, just to quickly reiterate, is we've set up a series of media queries, and you may not need to set up this many. This is just for illustrative purposes. I've set up a series of media queries that progressively get smaller, and our root font size also progressively gets smaller. And because we're using the Rem, this 4:3:1 ratio will be preserved regardless of the viewport size. The fonts will just progressively get smaller. Okay, so if I refresh and we go real big, we can see this is our 1000 and larger. We can see 4:3:1 multipliers. And then if we progressively get smaller, you can see once we get smaller than 1000, you saw that little jump. It can progressively get smaller, and it continues to get a little bit smaller, and 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 so on and so forth. Okay, and so we've preserved now the ratio between H1 paragraph, H2, between all of these elements, and that ratio remains the same regardless of the size of your viewport. So it's a way to sort of progressively resize typography But the great thing about it is you're not having to change every single typographic element. You're only having to change your root. And the other really nice thing about this is if you've decided, okay, the H1 is just ridiculously large, I want to change this to 3, 2, 1 instead, you can do that, and you only have to make that change one time, and your media queries will still handle and inherit those changes. So again, we can see if we resize it, just is progressively getting smaller to a point where it makes sense for whatever particular device that you're on. Okay, let's quickly recap. So what we've done is set up a set of media queries and change the font size of the root element in each of the media queries. This is just one method for dealing with font size in responsive design. But it's really easy to grasp concept, and I hope you'll find it useful. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe to my channel or check out some of my other videos. Thanks, and see you next time.